Okay, so we are back for the circle game explanation of the universal circle system for character and game creation, or just like mapping. And we finished a part one of these, and in part one we broke down the rings. There's an element ring which we copied over from the original circle. There's some other elements out here which are like our third level elements, which I'll pick up from there, which is where we left off last time. There's a class circle, a species circle, a statistics circle, and a land type circle. And then outside are just common character classes that you might be familiar with, or common characters, and where they would fit roughly on this system. So we left off talking about these tertiary elements, and we noticed that there's this nice thing that occurs where like ore is over here, moss is for plants, blood is for animals, wine is for humans, oil is for aliens. And I haven't talked about these classes or species yet. So we talked about these, and they're pretty evident or obvious why or where they fit there, what they came from. Smoke is fire and light, so forth and so on. So now I guess we want to talk about the classes and species next. And I think I'm going to talk about the species first. Or do I want to do... I'm thinking about something for a minute, so bear with me. Yeah, I guess... Let's see. I guess I'll do... I want to do the species first, I think. So, something for the species that stands out real obvious is the plants and animals. Because I thought, well, okay, you could have a plant-like organism, Swamp Thing or whatever, and plant from creatures from Little Shop of Horrors or something like that. You have this plant creature, and animals. Obviously, you have beasts and all sorts of things that are animal-based, and all the alien species that are based off of animal types. And so that just made sense to copy plants and animals over as, what thing are you? What species are you? Are you a plant? Are you an animal? We're in this fantastical, mystical world. You think of tree folk creatures in like Tolkien's world. There's plant creatures. Because it's part of this whole thing, and something can be a plant. So, okay. So plants and animals came over pretty easy. And then so did, obviously, well, if there's plants and animals, we need humans, because there's always that humanoid form, the anthro form. And that was coming from animals into individuals, egos and individuals, right? So those ones came over pretty easily. And then, in a sense, it was like, well, what's the advanced humans? Are the aliens something different? Or like, yeah, they're aliens. They're extraterrestrial, And that kind of made sense over here as like heading up into groups, because it takes groups of people to go to space, and you have your whole civilization of spacefaring people. And it was more like, okay, it seemed nice flow from plants to animals to humans to aliens. Another thing that kind of made sense was because it was like, well, what about robot creatures? That came to mind really early. And robot stuff is obviously like where all the electronics and physics and tech type things are. So it made sense to put them kind of over here with physics and space and math and computers. And it was kind of a no-brainer at that point to say, oh, well, they're somewhere over here. So you have plants, animals, humans, aliens seemed like a good choice. Robots was kind of like, okay, remember we're over in this inorganic side of things, totally mechanical. Well, that's where that lives, right? And then the last few kind of filled themselves in. It was like, well, what other creatures or types of things? You have to create a system that encompasses all possible beings that could ever exist, right? Or something has to be kind of represented in the system. And I thought of shapeshifters. I was like, well, what is a shapeshifter itself? Like in Terminator, it's a metal thing, but in Star Trek, there's like, living beings that come out of a lake, Odo and stuff that are shapeshifters, and the tree folk or some of the other creatures in Tolkien's universe are shapeshifters or something, right? So I was like, well, or druids, you sometimes think of as shapeshifters, trees that shape. shift into bears, and it's like, well, what is a shapeshifter? If it's all species, it's kind of its own species, or it's the omni thing. But you'll see a class here, it's called an omnid. That's kind of the reason why. We'll get into that. But shapeshifters, to me, I said, well, shapeshifters make sense with the transmutation part. That's like the beings that they have control over all the atoms and stuff, right? In the material science, and they're able to shift in to look like all these other beings. So that's kind of the control group for the shifters. And I said, well, that's got to be over there then. So then we had robot shifters, plants, and the shifters are often connected to the plants. You know, like I said, you think about them turning into plants or things that flow and ooze and goo from ore to moss. And so, okay, so now we had robots, and it fit well with like Terminator, because he was the metal. Metal is ore, and metal is over here, and metal in material science and metallurgy, and he was a robot that was a shifter. Okay. Not that all robots are shifters, but it made sense. So you had robots, shifters, plants, animals, humans, aliens. And then I kind of said to myself, well, what's left? And I said, we have to go bigger than aliens then, right? Because we're going around that scale from small to big. And here's some of these things where I talk about the correspondences. If you listen to the last 2 videos ago or whatever, I was talking about how complements across the opposite side of the circle tend to do certain things. It's interesting to me, things start to come up where it's interesting. This is a little tangent. It's interesting to me, for example, that physics and space and astronomy and all that macro tech, nano and macro tech, but that idea is over here in physics, right? But that space, the actual understanding of what space is and everything is over here in physics and outer space and astronomy. But then when you get to humans, our exploring of it is directly opposite on this other side of the circle, where you've got like aliens and like the Jedis and things that would explore space. Out on this human side, where it takes all this oil and steam and technology, and you see some of these complements happen a lot the more you look at these systems. Any case, back to what's bigger than aliens? Well, I said, well, what about all the things that aren't aliens but are like vampires or above aliens somehow, and they're supernatural, right? And if you think about it, this is the natural side over here, nature. We have that whole thing on the circle, nature and human. So to be supernatural is to be above nature or beyond the explanation that nature gives. And that's kind of like your ghosts and your vampires, or, you know, a werewolf is like a supernatural animal. It's that something happened to it to now where it's above nature, but it's an animal still. So aliens, supernaturals, which I thought was more, I used to call it supernaturals, but I thought it more concise, or just felt better over time to call them supernals. Thought it was more interesting that way. It's a little bit more catchy. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So I've got aliens, I've got supernals here, which comes from supernaturals. And I said, well, what's left? There's nothing much left. You've covered everything now that could possibly ever exist, from fantasy to dragons. The dragon's a supernatural animal. You know, but you kind of just have the gods, right? At the top of everything is things that are completely outside of time and space, or they've got some crazy powers, Mr. Universo, or, you know, whatever. Something that the Raiden from different series, or something that you think of as a god, Thor, or Zeus, or whatever. The immortals. And that kind of made sense too, even your robots, because the robot's technical thing that's mechanical and could technically last as long as the immortals do, as long as it keeps being remade or recreated. It's just material, right? So you kind of have everything. Once you have immortals, you know, what else is there? There's nothing left. So from the technical, mechanical, non-alive creature that we've made alive, the robot, up to the thing that can make itself into a robot almost if it wants, or that can shift and has all the control over the elements, into the things that are now natural, plants, animals, humans, aliens, going supernatural again as we get over to and to something that's completely immortal, back to that's where that system comes from. So that's your species. What are you? And anything that you want to build, you could kind of say, oh, I'm a you could be all 8. You could be a supernatural, immortal, and a robot. Okay, great. But usually you'd pick 1 or 2 or 3 and create, that's going to cover most character classes you'd ever want to create. And you could have an alien animal, or if you try to think of something, you know, a vampire is a supernatural human, right? So you could, you could just fit whatever character you need into that system with those 8, pretty much. The treants in Token were plant shifters, So, okay. I think I've got time here to go on to the classes. So the classes, when I think of D&D or I think of game and character design, some of the original classes or the most juxtaposed classes, you always had the brute guy and the smart guy, or the fighter and the thinker. You have your warrior and your mage, or your warrior and your sorcerer or something, spellcaster and your sword user. Those are probably the 2 biggest classes of some of the earliest D&Ds of anything, your idea of just who's fighting and who's doing what. And of course, some of the other early ones were like rogues and melee characters, or thief or something, or bard even. But, so I knew you had to have warriors and mages somehow. I said, okay, that's so quintessential to game design to have a warrior and a mage. They kind of represent those categories or classes. They're going to have to go somewhere. And so those were the 2 that I started, and they've moved over time, but they've really settled into where they're at now. And how do I want to explain this? Give me a second. Okay, so when I think of a warrior, some of the first things that I started associating with it, I said, well, warriors usually have to do with strength and life. But the warrior is all about his life force and staying alive, and he take the wounds and heal, and it's his blood, and he's bleeding. And I had blood, and I said, and he's a fighter, right? And that's kind of that animalistic nature of the human. It's broken down to having to fight. It's strength, it's trained, it's all athletic, it's in its most animalistic form, and it's the fighter. So I knew warrior had to go somewhere down near animals. And I said, okay. So warrior ended up in that part of the circle early on. And then I knew mage had to be juxtaposed to it somehow, either across from it this way or across from it this way, or somehow it had to be farther away from it because it's the opposite kind of. They kind of represent the whole opposite thing. Well, we knew that air was something that usually is associated with thoughts and thinking and the intelligences and things like that. And mage, they're often, it's all about the intelligence class. So mages use magic that looks all plasma-y and shoots and does that. So it started to make sense that mages were somewhere up top here. Okay. And you kind of can think about it too, is if the mage has the same way the warrior's using the fighting and the animal and all the stuff down here, in a sense, the mage is somebody who, it's like they almost say magic is science, or that magic is just some high advanced science that we don't know. Well, that's the people who know all the quantum mechanics and general relativity and crazy magic and science that we don't know. Somehow that's where the mage is a master of and has embodied this. Or maybe naturally they've evolved, it's in their system at this point and they get their powers that way. But that's why that's kind of up there. It's connected to this idea of having control over the quantum mechanical, and that makes you magic. You manipulate the quantum mechanical, if you think about it that way. Up. I turned my thing. Hold on. I wanted to check my time. Okay, good. So, so that's why mage is up. It kind of ended up in that area. And then, let's see. So the other 2 more that came in kind of first were the rogue and the omnid. The omnid came in because I said, okay, I have a warrior, I have a mage, but like I had said earlier, one of the other classes that come to mind first for me from early D&D and stuff was always the thief or the rogue. And so, it's kind of you got your tank and your damage, or I guess mage is range damage, but we can get into that. But a rogue was another character that just seemed like it was early D&D or had to kind of have a rogue. And then the Omnid comes from, like, what is the jack of all trades? I guess in WoW, if you think about the druids, if you're familiar with the World of Warcraft world, a druid was like, well, what's its, a mage, its skill set, but where's a druid? It turns into an animal, it can be a tree, it could be a big owl bird, type thing, a boomkin, they used to call it, or whatever. So it was kind of like an everything. And it was like, well, what's something that's an everything, or a polymorph? The things that were just, like Odo on Star Trek, what's his class? And so I realized that had to be over the same way the mage kind of control the subatomic. The Omnids are the creatures that control all the more basic elements, or the atoms, and they can turn from one being into another, or kind of morph, or act like something else. They're fluid, like metal, or they're ore, or something. So that kind of made sense to go over here. And the rogue, I knew was a melee character, so it had to go near the warrior. Usually that's associated with, like, the human class is the rogue. And I thought aliens were good for rogue, too. But it's kind of like the thief and the wine. And we're going to get into this more. There was other things that over time I had realized about the circle, where I mentioned it in one of the videos, movement. You'll see this on another picture I'll pull up eventually. I might have it here. Let's see. This one, you'll see the word move down here. We'll come back to this at some other point. But movement is because things that are solid are frozen and they don't move. And as you add energy from fire to the opposite side of the circle, you heat things up and create water. You add energy to a solid, you get a liquid. That gets it to flow and to move. So movement, things over here are solid and don't move, but movement starts over on this side of the circle, if you think of it that way, and goes across to this side of the circle. And rogues are usually associated with fast movement and stabbing, or things like that, stealing and thief and being quick, where a warrior is more about being strong. So I knew that the rogue had to be more on the movement side of things. And so that ended up kind of over here near humans. And I'm going to run out of time. So we had mage, warrior, rogue, and an omnid. And I called it omnid just from the word omni, because it's kind of like does everything. I wanted a general word of a class that were your jack of all trades that kind of did everything. So mage, omnids, warriors. But then I thought of like the heavy tanks and things like paladins and samurai and just other stuff that were a warrior's a fighter, but he's almost as good or better at attack as he is defense. Where I was like, well, what's just something that's like heavy defense? And that's kind of like your guardian. The plant, it's so strong, it's just like a tree or a wall or a rock. And it's these characters that are your super heavy tank. And they're more about defense than they are about attack. They're not just life, they're life in earth. They're like the grounding, So I said, okay, well, this guardian, eventually I like the word guardian for the class, is somewhere between an omnid and a warrior. And it's like a plant guardian, or it's just a guardian though, because the plant's obviously the species, but I still associate kind of, okay, there's your guardian over there. So now we've got mage, omnid, guardian, warrior, rogue. And then these last three over here, where did they come from? Well, at one point I kept having an oracle class, which I eventually moved to the outside. And I was thinking of things like mystics and genies and other things. I thought they were different. I also thought of things that were like, well, there's mages, but there's also wizards and warlocks, and they're like the hardcore mage, or, what's different with them? Why are they so special? And what makes a difference between a wizard and a mage? So I realized that, well, there had to be a class of like high mages, your wizards and your warlocks and stuff. So that's sorcerers. And that had to be more towards the light and more towards just total control of all the rules via the logic and the sets and set theory and using the light. And things over here, they were controlling it from almost like the rule sense. They can just bend the rules, if you think about it that way. And they have this kind of immortal level control over things. So they're sorcerers. And then, yeah, this mystic class, it was like, well, where does an oracle go? And so we'll get into why priests and certain healers are opposite and which parts are melee and ranged and stuff, but oracle was one that I couldn't quite fit in else. When you think of things that are supernatural, they're usually also very mystical. It's not like pure magic, but it's also more about like the spirituality behind it. And now you're getting back towards that part of the circle over here through fire and passion and spirits and occult and stuff coming back this way. And smoke. Smoke was the third element here. And mystic stuff is usually, you imagine it all being smoky and mystical. And fire and light. That's like the mystic. And so I have a mystic class here. And then lastly, there was things that were like a different kind of rogue. Or I just kept thinking of like engineers in certain games that have like an engineer class. And I didn't like the way they fit elsewhere. And it kind of fit in with the Steam over here, the aliens. And humans are the rogues. They'll stab you and drink your wine. But aliens are all about tactics and which planet to take over and space and oil and things like that. And once I had all these things on the outside too, which we'll talk about more, I want to end this. We're going over 22 minutes already. I ended up liking this idea of a tactician kind of character class over here. And we can talk about what they are and why. So I'm going to kind of quickly cut this off because this is just a rule I'm making for myself. I want these around 20 minutes or so. So people can take them in pieces if they want. And just to have, it's easier to upload different size, smaller videos and things like that. Or if I have to edit it or something. But I'll finish with that on this one. So in this one we went over the elements again. We talked about the classes and the species a bit. Species and classes a bit. So I'll probably pick up from that on the next one. I don't know if I'm going to do it tonight. I might. I've done 3 or 4 of these today. My voice is getting a little raspy. But I'm kind of on a roll, so I think I might crank out one more. But from here, we'll go on to we'll recap some of this, and then we'll build into the stats, and then how some of this works, and these lands out here. And then after that, I don't know, maybe we can talk about the game itself or other things. But for now, I'll leave it with that. So here's more on the Circle game system and how it connects to the Circle of Knowledge. Feel free to leave comments or ask questions. And thanks for watching.